Another chapter unfolds in the relentless struggle for Africa's true liberation. A struggle not just for borders or flags, but for dignity, sovereignty, and truth long buried under the weight of foreign interests. A storm is brewing, not of nature, but of awakening, a collective roar rising from a continent tired of being plundered, patronized, and politicized. The world needs to hear what Africa has always known. This is not just about security or diplomacy. It's about survival, legacy, and control of destiny. In a recent address to the U.S. Congress, General Michael Langley,
AFRICOM's campaign revolves around central themes of ensuring strategic access, countering threats to the homeland and U.S. interests, preparing for and responding to crisis, and lastly, bolstering our allies and partners. This campaign places our African partners at the center, achieving positive change by executing African-led and U.S.-enabled operations focused on our shared objectives. In Africa, modest investments and resources go a long way towards achieving our national security interests. Africa faces many challenges, but also offers even more opportunities. With our African partners at the forefront, reinforced by our efforts and the efforts of our allies, we will continue to gain ground towards achieving lasting stability, security, and prosperity on this crucial continent.
Langley, commander of the United States Africa Command, AFRICOM, outlined a reinvigorated American strategy to secure the continent from terrorism. He emphasized aligning capabilities to threats, citing a sharp 40% rise in terrorism. But beneath this calm, calculated rhetoric lies a growing fear across African nations. Fear that this is merely another chapter in a long playbook of foreign militarization cloaked as humanitarian concern. Langley's remarks, especially given his African heritage, struck a nerve. Many are asking, is this not reminiscent of Libya's tragic collapse under the pretense of civilian protection? Senators asked pointedly about the most urgent needs. Langley stressed force protection, integrated air defense systems, ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, and other critical assets to maintain U.S. troop safety. However, the broader African public is not buying into the narrative. For over a decade, the U.S. military footprint has expanded across the continent, yet groups like Boko Haram still terrorize Nigeria, Sudan bleeds from ongoing conflict, and chaos grips the Democratic Republic of Congo. What exactly has been secured? There's a pattern emerging, one too clear to ignore. Wherever there's unrest, there's often also a trail of valuable resources: gold, cobalt, rare earth minerals. Africa's wounds become opportunities in the eyes of foreign powers. Is terrorism really the enemy, or is it just the cover story? The AFRICOM playbook speaks of strategic access, defending U.S. interests, responding to crises, and supporting partners. But who defines the partners? And whose interests are truly being defended? The narrative speaks of African-led and U.S.-enabled operations, yet the growing sentiment across the continent is that African voices are too often overshadowed by foreign agendas. Modest investments, they say, bring high returns in security. But at what cost to the autonomy and future of the continent? This paradox is stark. While billions flow into African military missions, many in the U.S. grapple with homelessness, debt, and gun violence. Why, then, such relentless focus on a continent they label as poor? Could it be the riches beneath African soil rather than the people above it that fuel this obsession? One voice rises louder than the rest, a courageous African woman laying bare the enduring wounds inflicted by France on its former colonies.
Between 1958 and 1961, France did something absolutely horrible. France made the Francophone African countries, and I don't even want to use that terminology, but I only use it for the purposes of conversation. The 14 countries which were formerly, but still colonized by the French, they were forced to sign a document that they called the Pact for the continuation of colonization. You heard me. The Pact for the continuation of colonization. If you want your independence, you must sign this. Guinea, Secretary said absolutely not. Mali said absolutely not. France, pack your bags and go on back home. France could not believe it. Could not understand that an African country, these monkeys, do not want to be affiliated to France. They said, we will show you. So history tells us France went into those two countries, took everything that they thought they had brought to those two countries, including the last teaspoon and chair, proceeded to pour concrete into the sewage pipes, completely devastating the two economies. The then newly appointed president of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, in his efforts to rescue these two economies, created the first ever union of any African states, Ghana, Guinea, and Mali. But what that did was it made the other African countries realize that if they go against France, this was the fate that was waiting them. So what do? Wait the paper. And they signed. What did the pact say? One. The pact said, you monkeys, you don't know how to manage your money. So you shall deposit 85% of your bank reserves with the French Central Bank under the control of the French Minister of Finance. And that France is going to take your deposits from the individual countries, pool them together, invest them in the French stock market under the French name. And you, monkeys, you may or may not know the returns. Latest figures are showing this is still going on since 1958. France today is collecting out of Africa over $500 billion before investing. And when they finish investing this money, for every 14 billion out of Africa, they're recognizing over 300 billion. Now do the math. So when it's actually said and done, France is taking out of Africa trillions of dollars every year, and we, the poor Africans, are gladly giving it to France. And the same France has the audacity to look at us and call us poor people. 1958. They went further with the pact. You say, we will also print your own money. We will print your money for you. They instituted what they were calling the CFA, special currency for the African countries, and that only France can print that money for you. They went on to say all the contracts, large contracts, public and private, French companies have the first right of refusal. All your minerals discovered, yet to be discovered, France has the first right of refusal. Now, my brothers and sisters, if one of you was to wake up one morning and you're president of one of those countries, and your chief of staff walks in first day and starts reading you out the do's and don'ts as stipulated by the Pact for the Continuation of Colonization, what power do you have? None. And the same countries that are stealing from Africa, they have the audacity to look at Africa and say, Africans, what's wrong with you? Why can't you all take care of yourselves? Well, let's start by leaving our $500 billion on the continent. But what they do instead, they want to throw you with a smoke screen. Your African leaders are corrupt. Well, you know, I gave you that. I mean, not all African leaders are corrupt. Africa is a family. No family is complete without crazy Aunt Sally and crazy Uncle Tom. Nobody's perfect. Okay, fine, so I'll give you that. Their own figures are saying 50 billion is getting out of Africa from corruption. Fine, I'll give you that. But you do not want me to engage in a conversation that's solely limited to the $50 billion out of Africa through corruption. First, you don't tell me where it's going. You simply tell me it's getting out of Africa. But secondly, there's a bigger thief. You got two thieves, one with a briefcase with 50 billion and the other thief with a briefcase with 500 billion. I am a smart woman. You want me to ignore the one with 500 billion and put all my energies on a suitcase with 50? And by the time the one with 500 billion is done investing, we are talking trillions. Now, do you see how quickly the funds out of Africa from corruption become the larger chunk under the table? And they want you to stay under the table. So you never have to talk about what is on the table. We must wake up, Africans. We must think about our situations. How did we get here? Are we willing to
Her
let
speech,
France...
both passionate and damning, exposes the dark underbelly of so-called independence. Between 1958 and 1961, France forced 14 newly independent African nations into signing what they deceptively called the Pact for the Continuation of Colonization. The terms were staggering. These nations were required to deposit 85% of their foreign reserves into the French central bank, where France would invest the money under its own name, reaping vast profits while Africans received mere scraps. Those who resisted, like Guinea and Mali, were punished severely. France stripped their infrastructure, sabotaged their economies, even poured concrete into sewage lines. These retaliations served as warnings. Other nations, terrified of similar fates, complied and signed. Under the pact, France retained first rights over mineral extraction, exclusive control over currency printing through the CFA franc, and veto power over major contracts. In effect, political independence came shackled to economic slavery. Even today, the system persists. France annually pulls out over $500 billion from Africa before reinvesting it for its own gain. And yet, it dares call Africans poor. The hypocrisy is jarring. Meanwhile, global narratives obsess over $50 billion in African corruption, painting the continent as its own worst enemy. But who is the real thief? The corrupt official with $50 billion or the foreign power quietly siphoning $500 billion? Africans are told to look under the table, to focus on petty theft while ignoring the grand larceny happening right in front of them. Still, some continue to resist. Burkina Faso has exposed yet another French spy, this time masquerading as a humanitarian worker. Under the guise of charity, handing out sweets, donating books, he covertly captured and transmitted strategic images to French intelligence, allegedly plotting strikes against the government. He now faces 27 years in prison. This is not an isolated incident. 4 other French nationals were recently accused of espionage. If Burkina Faso is truly so poor, why does France keep returning in disguise? In Ghana, the story unfolds differently, but the underlying theme remains. After asserting control over its gold trade and blocking foreign companies from underpaying local miners, the Ghanaian government launched a national gold board to ensure fair pricing. Suddenly, the United States issued a travel advisory, warning citizens about visiting Ghana, citing concerns over crime, women's safety, and LGBTQ issues. But many see through the veil. Was this truly about safety, or was it a veiled retaliation for Ghana's move toward economic sovereignty? Every time Africans assert control over their resources, they face pushback, diplomatic, military, economic. This isn't coincidence. It's a pattern, a strategy, a soft power war in full swing. Africa, they say, is no longer sleeping. Its people are awakening, and the message is echoing across borders. We will no longer be pawns in anyone's geopolitical game. We will no longer be silenced, bought, or broken. Africa's awakening is not just about resisting foreign interference. It's about reclaiming truth, identity, and power stolen through centuries of deceit. The winds of change are no longer whispers. They are thunderclaps rumbling from the Sahel to the Gulf of Guinea, from Kinshasa to Accra. And in this resurgence, names like Captain Ibrahim Traoré are no longer just leaders. They are symbols of defiance against neo-imperial forces that still see Africa as a playground for profit. The espionage saga in Burkina Faso stands as a chilling reminder of how deep the claws of foreign powers still reach. Disguised as benevolence, manipulation comes with cameras instead of guns, with donations instead of diplomacy. The recently exposed French agent who infiltrated the country posing as a humanitarian not only deceived communities but also actively transmitted intelligence aimed at undermining the government. His arrest was no fluke, it was a wake-up call. One alert soldier in Ouagadougou saw past the polished disguise and sounded the alarm. The spy confessed, revealing he had been funneled through Ivory Coast and embedded as a so-called freelancer to destabilize the country from within. But this was no isolated scheme. Months earlier, 4 other French nationals were apprehended for similar covert activities. So the question lingers, if Burkina Faso is the poorest country in the world, as foreign powers often label it, why are they so eager to infiltrate, to spy, to destabilize? What is it in Burkina Faso that they desperately want to control? The answer lies not in pity narratives, but in power, minerals, and resistance. Meanwhile, Ghana's story is a lesson in economic retaliation disguised as diplomacy. After President Nana Akufo-Addo declared that Ghana would no longer allow foreign interests to buy its gold at exploitative prices, a storm of subtle threats followed. For years, foreign buyers acquired gold from small-scale miners for a pittance, buying an ounce, worth over $13,000 on global markets, for just $300. This daylight robbery went unchecked until Ghana took a bold step, forming a national gold board to regulate the market and ensure miners earned fair value. Almost immediately, the U.S. responded with a travel advisory, warning Americans against visiting Ghana. The stated reasons: safety concerns, especially for women and LGBTQ travelers. But many Africans see through the smokescreen. The timing is too convenient. The motive too clear. When Africa begins to control its own wealth, the pushback is swift, cloaked in concern but rooted in control. And yet, this tactic is as old as colonialism itself. Distract, demonize, and divide. Focus the global lens on Africa's flaws, its poverty, its corruption, its internal divisions, while quietly siphoning off its resources, its potential, and its future. And when African nations fight back, when they dare to break free of unfair contracts, foreign monetary systems, and exploitative trade, they are met not with applause but with obstruction. This is not paranoia. It's history repeating itself with new packaging. Colonialism never died. It simply evolved. It now wears the suits of diplomats, the language of aid, and the flags of foreign bases built on African soil. It whispers promises of security while securing contracts. It offers partnerships while scripting the terms unilaterally. But Africa is no longer asking for permission. Across the continent, a generational shift is taking root. Young Africans are no longer just inheritors of past pain, they are architects of a different future. They are asking hard questions. Why does France print the money for African states? Why must 85% of reserves still be housed in foreign banks? Why are Western narratives fixated on corruption when the greater theft is carried out under the cover of bilateral agreements and economic coercion? The old lies are crumbling. Africans know that the issue isn't just corrupt leadership, though corruption exists, but systemic looting enabled by global financial structures, old colonial pacts, and strategic misinformation. It's a well-oiled machine designed to keep the continent kneeling while telling it to stand proud. Yet the tide is shifting. Leaders are rising who refuse to be puppets. Movements are building that demand fairness, not favors. Communities are educating themselves and others about the true cost of foreign help. The cries for sovereignty, justice, and unity are no longer whispered. They're broadcast, sung, and shouted in every corner of the continent. This is not just a rebellion against foreign control, it is a renaissance of African consciousness. The continent is no longer waiting for permission to rewrite its story. It is doing so boldly, with clarity, and with the undeniable weight of history on its side. For too long, Africa has been portrayed as a victim, helpless, unstable, dependent. But the truth is emerging: Africa was never poor. It was impoverished by design. The real poverty lies in the moral bankruptcy of those who, under the banners of partnership and peace, have drained its lands, divided its people, and destabilized its governments, all while preaching progress. The continent's gold, uranium, diamonds, oil, cobalt, and rare earth minerals are not just commodities, they are symbols of a stolen future. And every policy, every military campaign, every advisory warning must be viewed through the lens of control. Not security. Not democracy. Control. Even the accusations of corruption, while not unfounded, have become a strategic distraction. The world is constantly told about the $50 billion Africa loses annually to corrupt elites. But few speak of the $500 billion extracted annually by France alone from former colonies. Fewer still mention the trillions lost over decades through rigged trade, lopsided contracts, and forced dependence. When weighed on the scales of injustice, the real thief becomes unmistakably clear. Africa has no illusions about its own flaws. It does not claim perfection. But what it demands now is truth. It demands that the world stop pretending the real villains are local when the most powerful systems of exploitation are global, hidden behind polite diplomacy, and delivered with a smile. It demands that the focus shift from who's stealing crumbs to who owns the bakery. This movement is no longer limited to intellectual circles or activist spheres. It's reaching villages, schools, markets, and city squares. It's in the voices of women who are reclaiming history, in the decisions of leaders who are breaking away from old alliances, and in the hearts of young people who refuse to inherit silence. They are rejecting the narrative of Africa as a continent in need of saving, and asserting it as one in need of respect. The world is watching, but more importantly, Africa is watching itself. It is measuring the cost of every handshake, every base built on its soil, every agreement signed behind closed doors. The age of blind trust is over. The age of critical awareness has begun. And as more countries push back, whether by arresting spies, nationalizing industries, or tearing up predatory pacts, the message becomes clearer: Africa is not for sale. What foreign powers once did in the shadows is now being exposed in broad daylight. Every covert mission, every economic trap, every manipulative narrative is being called out. The fog is lifting, and what lies beneath is not chaos, but clarity. Clarity about who has taken, who has lied, who has benefited, and who must be held accountable. The reckoning is here. The veil has been lifted, and no amount of soft power, media spin, or diplomatic niceties can hide the scars anymore. Africa is looking its oppressors in the eye, not with fear, but with fire. No longer asking to be seen, it is demanding to be heard. In the past, when African nations resisted exploitation, they were punished. Economically isolated, politically destabilized, militarily overrun. Guinea and Mali stood up to France in the 1960s, and in return had their economies stripped bare, their independence mocked with acts of deliberate sabotage. These were not isolated acts of vengeance, they were messages. Messages that said, "Defy us, and we'll break you." But today, those same messages are being met with a louder one: "Break us, and we'll rise stronger." African youth now speak of liberation not as an abstract idea but as a lived necessity. They're not only reclaiming their identity, they're building infrastructures of autonomy. Local industries, digital platforms, political movements, and educational reforms that unlearn the colonizers' version of history. They're digging beneath the superficial partnerships and finding the clauses that enslave their economies. They're no longer fooled by the headlines or seduced by foreign grants that come tied to the extraction of rights and resources. And while foreign interests are trying to mask their desperation with increased aid, travel advisories, and peace missions, Africans are unmasking their intentions. They see the travel warnings as tools of economic intimidation. They recognize humanitarian efforts as potential Trojan horses. They know that foreign bases don't bring protection, they bring surveillance. Surveillance not for African safety, but for Western strategy. Burkina Faso and Ghana are just early pages in a broader revolution. Leaders like Ibrahim Traoré are not anomalies, they're signals of a shifting tide. A generation that once deferred to the West now demands space on the world stage, not as subordinates, but as equals. And when they are met with resistance, they do not retreat. They expose. They confront. They endure. The narrative is no longer theirs to write alone. Africa is taking back the pen. Africa's reclamation of its voice is not just symbolic, it is strategic, deliberate, and irreversible. The continent is no longer content with reacting to foreign maneuvers, it is now setting the agenda. From West Africa to the Horn, from mineral-rich basins to the grassroots of rural towns, there is a shared momentum, an awakening that transcends borders, tribes, and languages. The long-standing strategy of divide and rule is losing its grip, crumbling under the weight of a people who are finally beginning to see each other not as competitors, but as kin in a shared struggle. The hypocrisy of global powers is now glaring. How can countries that claim to champion human rights simultaneously support regimes, systems, and contracts that rob entire nations of sovereignty? How can they criticize Africa's leadership while funding the very structures that keep them dependent? The moral high ground they've long claimed is eroding fast under the light of inconvenient truths. And now, Africans are asking the questions the world hopes they won't. Why does a continent so rich remain so economically shackled? Why must countries beg for loans against their own gold and oil? Why are the architects of global institutions the same ones benefiting from the dysfunction those institutions perpetuate? These questions are not coming from professors and politicians alone, they are echoing in music, art, town halls, and protests. The continent's cultural voice is aligning with its political stance, forming a unified front that speaks not just to policy, but to purpose. The so-called international community finds itself at a crossroads. It can no longer ignore this movement, nor can it suppress it with the same old tools: military alliances, conditional aid, and moral lectures. Africa is watching, and so is the world. And for once, the narrative is no longer being dictated from Washington, Paris, or Brussels. It's coming from Bamako, Ouagadougou, Accra, and countless communities tired of silence. For every treaty that favors the former colonizers, there are now voices ready to tear it apart. For every IMF or World Bank prescription, there's a local economist with a better, sovereign alternative. For every soldier deployed on African soil under the guise of peace, there's a camera, a community, a movement ready to document, resist, and respond. The future is no longer a matter of negotiation, it's a matter of reclamation. This reclamation is not fueled by hate, it is fueled by history. A history written in blood, betrayal, and resilience. Africans are not seeking revenge, they are demanding recognition. They are asking the world to see the continent not as a charity case or a conflict zone, but as a powerhouse, intellectually, culturally, and economically. For too long, the world has profited off Africa's silence. That silence has ended. The continent's youth are no longer emigrating just for opportunity. They are staying to create opportunity. They are returning from the diaspora armed with knowledge, networks, and a fire to rebuild what was stolen. They are questioning why African central banks are still tied to European capitals. They are building fintech platforms to bypass the colonial banking systems. They are refusing to let foreign multinationals be the middlemen in the trade of their own natural wealth. And for every foreign base, for every intelligence operation disguised as aid, for every lopsided trade deal, there is growing scrutiny. Governments once compliant under pressure are now drawing lines in the sand. The question is no longer whether Africa will stand up, it is how far it will go once it does. There is also a deepening understanding that sovereignty is more than flags and national anthems. It's control over currency, media, minerals, and mines. It's the right to say no, to aid with strings attached, to troops without accountability, to investments that gut local industries. It's the courage to speak out, even when silence seems safer. In a world that relies on Africa's resources to fuel its technology, industries, and militaries, the true power of the continent is finally being acknowledged, by its own people first. They are beginning to realize that the West needs Africa far more than Africa needs the West. And with that realization comes a shift, no longer negotiating from a place of desperation, but from one of strength. This is not just a political awakening. It is spiritual, cultural, generational. It is the rise of a new consciousness that refuses to be pacified with slogans or symbolic gestures. It wants land, control, equity, and it will not stop until those demands are met. And so it continues, an unstoppable current pulsing through the heart of a continent long underestimated. This is not a fleeting wave of resistance, it is a redefinition of power. The eyes that once looked outward for validation now gaze inward with pride. The hands that once reached for permission now build without it. Africa is no longer waiting for a seat at someone else's table. It is building its own, forged from the very wood, stone, and steel that others came to steal. The exposure of covert foreign operations, like the French spy posing as a humanitarian in Burkina Faso, has become emblematic of a broader truth. Africa is under siege not by terrorists alone, but by foreign agendas masked as allies. And the people are no longer asleep. They are tracking the movements, reading between the lines, exposing the hypocrisy hidden behind humanitarian language. The spy's downfall wasn't orchestrated by foreign intelligence, it was caught by a local soldier. That moment, simple but profound, symbolized the shift, Africa protecting itself on its own terms. The world calls it instability. Africans call it reckoning. And while economic retaliation becomes the weapon of choice, like the U.S. travel advisory slapped on Ghana after its refusal to sell gold cheaply to foreign buyers, these threats are losing their sting. They are being met with defiance. Ghana's decision to create a gold board and regulate its mineral wealth was more than policy. It was a declaration of economic independence. And for that, it was painted as dangerous. But the real danger lies in the lie, the one that says Africans cannot manage their own wealth, that sovereignty comes with a price, that dignity must be negotiated. Africans are now rejecting that premise entirely. They are connecting the dots, between military presence and mineral-rich regions, between aid and influence, between debt and domination. They are realizing that the so-called help often comes in chains, and the promises of partnership too often serve only one side. This isn't just a narrative correction, it's a total narrative reset. A new generation of storytellers, thinkers, and leaders is rising. One that doesn't just want change but demands it, that doesn't just want inclusion but insists on redefinition. They are writing new textbooks, creating unfiltered media, reviving indigenous knowledge, and building cross-border solidarity that transcends the colonial lines drawn in Berlin over a century ago. No longer distracted by false divisions, no longer ashamed of their languages, cultures, and systems, Africans are embracing what was once called backward, and realizing it was stolen wisdom all along. They are remembering who they were before they were told what to become. Yes, the remembering has begun, and with it, the unlearning. Unlearning the myths of dependency. Unlearning the idea that progress must mirror the West. Unlearning the indoctrinated shame that came with African names, languages, and belief systems. In their place, a fierce reclamation is taking root. It is not nostalgia, it is resurrection. Of pride, of principle, of power. For decades, Africa has been taught to measure its development by foreign benchmarks. GDPs shaped by extraction, success defined by loans, leadership validated by Western approval. But those metrics are losing their hold. Africans are asking, development for whom? Success at what cost? Stability that benefits whose investments? From the farmers in Mali refusing to give up land to foreign agribusiness, to the students in Nairobi questioning the relevance of Eurocentric curricula, to the technologists in Lagos creating systems that bypass global monopolies, the resistance is not abstract. It is material, tactical, real. Even the instruments once used to hold Africa down, like debt traps and dollar dependency, are now being scrutinized. Countries are discussing alternatives to colonial currencies, seeking trade in regional blocs, forging South-South alliances that don't require permission from global gatekeepers. The illusion of needing a savior is collapsing. The savior narrative itself is collapsing. This is why the pushback has grown louder. Why accusations of terrorism and instability ramp up just as African nations try to nationalize resources. Why countries suddenly become dangerous or undemocratic the moment they reject foreign dominance. But these smear campaigns are no longer effective. Africans now know the script, and they're rewriting it in real time. This isn't just geopolitical. It's deeply psychological. Because perhaps the greatest victory for colonial powers wasn't physical conquest, but mental. The slow erosion of confidence, the internalized belief that Africans needed to be governed, guided, saved. That they were not enough. That they were perpetually behind. But not anymore. There is power in naming your oppressor. Power in exposing the pact for the continuation of colonization. Power in pulling the curtain back on the farce of independence signed at gunpoint, with banks still held hostage, with natural resources still mortgaged to foreign capitals. And Africa is reclaiming that power, not in anger alone, but in clarity. Not just to dismantle, but to rebuild. The rebuilding is happening already. Not with foreign templates, but with local wisdom. Not with charity, but with justice. Not in isolation, but in unity. Africans are no longer competing for foreign approval, they are collaborating for collective advancement. The myth of African fragmentation is unraveling, replaced by a renewed sense of shared struggle and destiny. Africa stands at the edge of a great turning, no longer bowed, no longer silenced, no longer asking. The chains are being broken not with bullets, but with truth. With unity. With fearless voices echoing across borders, generations, and histories long buried. What was stolen will be reclaimed. What was hidden will be revealed. And what was once whispered in corners is now being shouted in the open. Africa is rising. This is not a plea for pity. This is a call for purpose. A call to every African, at home or abroad, young or old, to understand that the battle for Africa's future isn't coming. It's already here. It's in the stories we tell, the truths we defend, the choices we make. You are part of this story now. The question is, will you stand on the sidelines, or will you rise with us? If this message stirred something in you, if you felt the fire, the frustration, the hope, don't let it fade. Share this story. Let it be heard where silence once reigned. Let it reach every village, every city, every continent. Like this video if you believe Africa deserves more than exploitation. Subscribe to the channel if you believe in truth without filters, in sovereignty without compromise. And share it, because one voice becomes a movement when echoed by many. Together, we are more than what they told us we could be. We are not victims of history. We are the authors of what comes next. Stay awake. Stay humble. Stay united.